Welcome, everyone. I have a very exciting interview for you today. I know if you're a Christian or if you're a well-read person in general, you hate hearing about the Dark Ages and how those evil clerics and bishops stopped science for years. So I thought I'd bring a guy on and we're going to talk about this. Now, for those of you who are watching, why is it so early? It's because he is from Europe. And in Europe, the sun sets super early over there for some ridiculous reason. Now, he doesn't speak English properly like us Americans who invented the language, but I think we can get through with his thick accent. So welcome on in, David Hutchings. Pleasure to have you on the channel.
Howdy, y'all.
That's cheating.
Hi. Okay, yeah. I'm from England. I've got a cup of tea over here somewhere.
That's ridiculous. We only drink whiskey next to our gun racks, so okay. you gotta get with the program. I'm sure you're allowed those over there or something. But welcome to the channel. Tell us who you are and a little bit about your background.
Okay, my name is David Hutchings, as you can see, and I am a physicist by background. I got a first-class physics degree from the University of York in the north of England, which back in the day was the capital of England under the Roman Empire. So very important city. Constantine was crowned emperor in the city of York. So, and it's possible that Constantine might come up again later. Who knows? And after I got my degree, I did what's called a postgraduate certificate in education, which qualified me to teach physics at schools. And since then, I have taught what we call GCSE and A-level physics. So 14 to 18-year-olds, teach them physics at a school called Pocklington School in the north of England, which is the school that William Wilberforce went to. For hopefully your listeners will know about him. And then I also have a side hustle. I write books, and my modus operandi is that I team up with an expert in a particular field, and then I popularize their work. I sit with them, get to know them, read their work, and we plan out together a book that will popularize their ideas. It's one of the books we're going to talk about today. I'm also an elected fellow of the Institute of Physics in the UK, which is a pretty prestigious organization, and it's quite rare for a school teacher to be elected as a fellow. And that's partly in recognition of the popularization that I've been doing of the subject. And I'm an honorary research fellow at the University of Durham as well, in their School of Education.
Yeah. So this is the book we're going to talk about, ladies and gentlemen. This is a book you wrote a few years ago. And the first I heard about it is you were actually interviewed on an atheist channel, Tim O'Neill's channel, History for Atheists, with your co-author, David Ungurdiano. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, amazingly, you're the first person to get the second name correct and the first name wrong. He's called James Ungurdiano.
Oh, well, what are you gonna
do? Yeah, that's right. This is the book here. I had already written a couple of books about science and religion, and what I really wanted to do was ask the question: well, hang on, why are we writing these books in the first place? You know, why is there even a need? So I had already written. The book plugs are coming now. I had already written "Let There Be Science." With Professor Tom McLeish, who was a fellow of the Royal Society, which is just about the highest rank you can achieve as a scientist. And we'll talk about the Royal Society later. And then I had written a second book called God, Stephen Hawking and the Multiverse, with a chap called Professor David Wilkinson, who's an astrophysics. He's got a PhD in astrophysics and a PhD in theology, which is quite impressive. But I wanted to get to the nub of the issue. Why are we talking about science and religion? Why are we writing books about science and religion? Why are there all these ideas out there, all these Christians out there trying to convince people that they can be reconciled? Why does that happen in the first place? What's actually going on underneath it all? And as I did more work on that, it became more and more clear that what really seemed to happen was in the 19th century, a couple of very important books were written that changed everything. And I actually have those books, the original copies of those books, which is pretty amazing. The first one to be written was this one here. So this is an original copy from the late 1800s, 1879, this one. And this book is called The Conflict Between Religion and Science, and it's by a chap called John William Draper. And then the other one, which came a little bit later, in 2 volumes, you can see here, is called The Warfare of Science and Theology, a history of it. And that's by a chap called Andrew Dixon White. And I thought, okay, well, if these 2 books were the game changers, then I want to write a book about those books.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting is, like, when I was reading Francis Collins' book, he cites one of them as it's an authority on the subject, and I was like, wait a minute, I don't think this is right. But yeah, those 2 books really have been a pain. I cannot tell you how many TikTokers I come across where they're referring to those books and they don't realize it. They're referring to the ideas in those books. Like, just like last week, I responded to some pagan from Norway claiming that Christians went on massive book burnings throughout the Middle Ages. I mean, it's like, where did this stuff come from? Basically, those 2 books. And so you and your co-author wrote a very interesting book on this history, talking about why we basically have this common myth that's still sent around today, that the church and Christians everywhere were holding back science constantly and constantly getting in the way of everything. And so that's kind of what your book is about. What give us a little overview of kind of what the book is, and like what are you guys going to go into?
Okay, so in history, the term conflict thesis with a capital C and a capital T refers to a very specific claim or idea. It says that throughout history, religious people and religious thought and religious conduct has been at war with scientific people and scientific thinking and scientific conduct. So the conflict thesis is a claim about history. And that's very important to understand. It's really saying these are events. I'm just going to give you a long list of events whereby science and religion have been at war. It's separate to the idea that you often come across in on Reddit or something like that, that says science and religion are incompatible. So the conflict thesis is not a claim that the 2 are incompatible. It's a historical claim that the 2 have fought against each other. And that's actually, a lot of people don't understand the difference between those 2 ideas. So an analogy could be quite helpful, right? Imagine that there's a history written about 2 countries, and the history says these 2 countries have always been at war, and I'm going to give you a whole series of different battles between these 2 countries, right? But it wouldn't follow from that those 2 countries have to be at war, right? Like those 2 countries could come to peace. So just because historically they've been at war doesn't mean they have to be, right? And the conflict thesis is a historical claim that just says, look, religious thinking and scientific thinking have always fought against each other. But then there's this second claim. Well, go on.
Oh yeah, but we'll continue your thought and then I'll ask you next question.
But then the second claim of, well, that is because or scientific thinking and religious thinking cannot ever be united. That's a different claim, and that's the one that most often circulates. But in order to justify it, people often refer to the history to justify it. So it would be like meeting a citizen of of one of these countries, and you say, "Look, why can't you just get on with this other person from this other country?" And they say, "Because we can't get on. It's like impossible for us to get on. There's nothing that could bring about peace." And you say, "Well, why?" And then they say, "Because we've been at war in the past." Right? And so you've got 2 slightly different things going on there. And the people who say now that science and religion are incompatible use the conflict thesis to argue for their position. They say, well, they must be. Scientific thinking and religious thinking must be incompatible because look at all these historical events where science and religion have fought against each other. And then, of course, you get the rundown of the events, which are some of the ones you mentioned already, and I'm sure they're the ones you want to start delving into.
Well, yeah, I mean, we all know that Christianity and the church held back science. I mean, they used to think that the earth was flat and we were going to sail off the side. That's why they prevented Christopher Columbus. They held back medical advances. They instituted the dark ages. They persecuted scientists. This is the stuff I'm told every day on TikTok and Twitter and YouTube, that this is the history and the sources. Trust me, bro. So how do you refute that? How could you possibly refute that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's easy to get frustrated when you've done a bit of digging, but you do actually have to do a bit of digging to find out that those things aren't true. So, I mean, your rundown is a really good one. And if we take them historically, let's take them in historical order. So usually the first claim historically is that when Christianity began to have any kind of influence, the first thing it did was outlaw any other modes of thought, right? So as soon as the Roman Empire embraces Christianity, they say, right, we're not having any Greek philosophy, we're not having any Roman teaching that built on that. You're not going to read anything except the scriptures, right? And so to stop you from being able to read anything other than the scriptures, we're going to ban them and we're going to destroy them, right? That's a very early historical claim. That's one of the early ones, and an example that's often given is the Library of Alexandria.
Mm-hmm.
And in Carl Sagan's show Cosmos, he and the book that accompanies it, he said, Alexandria was this wonderful place where there were 500,000 scrolls of ancient wisdom, and there's this wonderful opportunity to gather together Greek thought, Roman thought, pagan thought, and launch a mission to Mars, right? And then what happened is that religious types came in and they basically banned the reading. They burned down the library. Now, Sagan doesn't say himself that the library was burned down by Christians, but there are plenty of other people that do, right, as part of this story.
Yep.
And then there's a film that came out recently called Agora, that paints a similar sort of picture, that the Christians were just wanted to destroy stuff. And there are things that are pointed to that are accurate quotes, right? So like Tertullian, the church father Tertullian, is quoted where he says, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Right? That's a real quote. That's not a fake quote. But people are then reading that they're joining dots together that don't exist or that don't line up and coming up with all sorts of weird conclusions. And so if you actually ask, well, okay, tell me the truth about the Library of Alexandria. So the truth is that it was mostly gone long before Jesus was born.
Yeah.
Right.
True.
The main library's gone. There's some daughter libraries, but they're pretty small, and nobody really knows whether they had any scrolls in them, or by that point. And then the date that is given for the Christians to burn it down, in the 5th century. By that point, there's possibly one library, the Serapeum, and it's really not got very much in it, and it's not really a big deal. And there's no record of its destruction, of any scrolls or anything like that. And it basically gets caught up in political turmoil between Christian factions, pagan factions, Jewish factions, and so on. The building gets attacked under pretty nasty circumstances. And then that whole story is combined with the Alexandrian library. It's combined with anything else. And so you have this grand mythology that the Christians burned hundreds of thousands of scrolls, when actually there is zero historical record of anything being destroyed.
Oh, go ahead. Finish your thought.
In fact, it's the flip side. The flip side is much more accurate. You could ask the question, well, how do we have any classical texts at all? How do we have Aristotle? How do we have Plato? How do we have these? How do we even know these guys existed, and how do we know what they wrote? How can you go and find their texts on the Internet Archive now? And the answer is that they were treasured by the Christians. When the Christians found these texts, some early on, 300, 400 AD, and some later, 1100, 1200, when Aristotle moved west again. They treasured these texts. They studied them. They were required studying if you wanted to go into the ministry, for example. And they were preserved in monasteries by monks who copied them up. And so you can turn the whole thing around and say, no, it isn't just that Christians didn't burn anything. It's that they're the reason that we had them in the first place.
What about Galileo though? They imprisoned Galileo for doing science. Isn't that what happened? This commenter says that. Well, what about Galileo? Like, that is the go-to example when it comes to the proof that Christianity held back science. We stopped Galileo from teaching the Copernican model. Boom, roasted.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the Galileo story is messy. And not a lot of people covered themselves in glory on any part of the conversation. So perhaps let's tackle the story. Let's talk about what happened. So, and we'll start with Copernicus, right? Is that okay to start with Copernicus?
Yeah.
So Copernicus is this good Christian guy committed to the church, and he's an astronomer. This is before the telescope is really developed, and he's not using a telescope. And he notices something very unusual, which is that if you imagine that you were in the position of the sun, then it suddenly becomes very easy to map out the behavior of the planets, right? Now, and I'll say that again, so it's really important. He says, if you imagine that you were where the sun was, then the orbits of the planets become quite simple, right? That's what he said. In fact, he said, imagine the sun at the center, and these questions that were really difficult for everyone else to solve because they thought the Earth was at the center become a lot easier, right? That was his claim, and he wrote a book to that effect. But he was quite embarrassed about it because in his model, the Earth would be spinning around the sun, and quite clearly the Earth was not spinning around the sun, because if the Earth was spinning around the sun, then we would all fall off it. And there's clearly no sensation of movement whatsoever. So he treated it as a mathematical fiction, basically. And it was a mathematical claim. This is a lot easier if you put the sun in the middle. But he thought if he actually published that, he was going to get laughed at and mocked. So he didn't publish. And some of his friends said, no, you really should. Okay. And his friends were all in holy orders. They were all Christians. And they eventually said, they eventually won him over and said, no, publish this book. Come on. And one of them even wrote a preface explaining, look, this is just a mathematical model, right? So that his friend wasn't mocked, basically. And then it was published, and in the same year or very soon after, Copernicus died, right? Now, some people have made the claim that Copernicus knew that the Earth was going around the sun, but that if he said it, the church would come after him. So he waited until his deathbed to publish. Now, that's an example of taking a set of facts and putting them all in the wrong order and getting a completely false story out of it. Okay?
Correlation isn't causation, basically.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Copernicus did not deliberately die as soon as his book was published, right? So then what happens is Galileo reads Copernicus's book, and he thinks, I think this might be real. Okay. And that's a pretty daring thought, because it's, in a lot of senses, it's stupid. There is no evidence that the Earth is moving at all to our senses, right? We don't feel like we're on a moving planet. And it didn't fit the physics of the day for the Earth to be moving. But Galileo is a very bright guy, and bit by bit, as he thinks about it more, he starts to become convinced that actually, you know what, the Earth could be moving, and we might not fall off it. And this is actually Copernicus, his model could actually be viable, right? Maybe the sun is in the middle. And this is really unpopular the main idea that gets communicated to people is that it's unpopular because the church don't like it, right? But the real reason it's unpopular is that it disagrees with Aristotle, right?
Yeah, I think at the time they said like it just went against everything we knew about Greek physics. And
Mm.
even today, the Copernican model still doesn't align with physics because he posited that the planets went around the sun in like perfect circles. And that doesn't happen. When Kepler and Newton developed elliptical models, okay, the physics made sense, but Copernicus couldn't explain this.
Yeah, that's right. And the circles were a hangover from Greek philosophy anyway, that Aristotle taught that the heavens were perfect, they were flawless, they were unbreakable, they were unchanging, they were undamageable. They were made of this fifth perfect element, and that element always moved in circles, and therefore you could only have circles. Anything other than a circle was unthinkable. And the Aristotelian cosmos just completely dominates all thought, right? Inside and out of the church. So what Galileo is saying is shocking, right? And he first gets in trouble talking about it in 1616 because everybody's angry with it. And he's made to sign an agreement saying, look, I'm not going to go against I'm not going to claim that this is true. I can put it forwards as a thesis, but I'm not allowed to go against the overall authority of Aristotle plus church, right? Like that's what's going on. But Galileo himself is a Christian. He's a pretty committed Christian. In 1615, when it all, just before the first stuff kicked off, he wrote a letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, where he sticks up for the Bible and the truth of Christianity as strongly as you'll read anybody say it, right? So he himself is a Christian, which is quite important for the story. And he's got a good friend who champions him, and this is all great and everything's wonderful. And then that friend later becomes Pope, right? And perhaps, we don't know this for a fact, but perhaps Galileo thinks, right, my big friend now has become Pope. I'm gonna really go for it. I'm gonna write down now that I think this is real, and I'll have the support of the Pope, and I don't need to worry about the people that aren't on my side, who are Aristotelians. And by that point, it's like 50-50 in the church about whether people think he's right or not. Okay. And so he writes this book, and he speaks to the Pope, and the Pope says, well, just make sure that you put in your book that it's only a theory, right? Just make sure you put that in. So he does put it in, but he puts it in the voice of a character that he calls Simplicio, or the fool, right?
Right.
And that gives you a little bit of an insight into Galileo's personality. He's kind of like I don't know, if you play sports, he's the guy with the sharp elbows, right? When even if it's just a pickup game or a kickabout game, he's going to leave one on you. And Galileo, I think, was a little bit like that. The Pope was incredibly offended. So you've got an offended Pope. You've got about 50% of the church thinking Galileo is wrong anyway. And he's got lots of political enemies. And so the whole thing is like this hotbed of people being annoyed with each other, and some of those people having more authority than others. Okay.
Right.
So Galileo gets put on trial.
Now, to be clear, he wasn't put on trial for doing science. He was put on trial for insulting the Pope and teaching his hypothesis as if it was like a proven fact or a proven theory. And they were like, you can't do that because this violates everything we know about physics.
Well, I think it was a little bit like catching Al Capone, right? They just wanted to get Galileo, and they were going to do it somehow. And so they're doing a combination of things, but really they just don't like the guy. And so they're hijacking this. Now, in the actual courts, he's asked, can you prove your model? And he couldn't prove it. In fact, his model was incorrect. It gave the wrong number of tides per day, right? And so the presiding inquisitor, a guy called Bellarmine, he says, look, let's not be too hasty in reading our Bibles. it's quite possible that we might interpret verses incorrectly, and then someone's going to discover something and show us that our interpretation was wrong. And if we've held our interpretation too tightly, we're going to make Christianity look stupid, and we're going to make God look like an idiot for writing something in his word that was wrong when it wasn't wrong. It was just our interpretation that was wrong. So he's giving a very measured view, and he says, but in this particular case, Galileo has not been able to prove what he said, which is true. He couldn't, right? So he actually lost it on scientific grounds. That his case was not scientifically solid. He's given a pretty low sentence. It's called vehement suspicion of heresy. It's like giving someone we want to find you guilty of something, but we haven't really got much, and so we'll get you on a technicality. And then he's not put in prison. John Merriman, who was a professor of modern European history at Yale University, and who literally wrote the textbook on modern European history, he told his undergraduate students that the church then burnt Galileo at the stake. Well, that's simply just not true. He went under various different forms of house arrest, which were sometimes living in his own house and sometimes living in other people's houses, friends' houses.
Very nice houses.
Very nice houses. Yeah, I wouldn't mind living in one of those houses. He carried on doing his physics. He wrote his most significant work about motion after that trial. He died a happy, healthy guy in his 70s. And what's happened is people want to paint it as science versus religion, when really it wasn't science versus religion at all. It was personalities clashing, and some of those personalities using religion and using religious texts to get what they wanted. But even then, you've got to split. Even in the trial, you've got to split amongst the cardinals, where some of them are saying, no, there's nothing wrong with what this guy's doing, and saying it's a pretty even split. So, and Galileo is a Christian. He's probably more devout than some of the people that convicted him.
Yeah, and I think that's important to note. This was not them cracking down on science. I mean, they didn't go after Kepler. They didn't go after Copernicus. This was clearly more of a political issue. As I remember Tony Christie saying, this was political. So yeah, that's kind of what's going on. Let's get to some super chats here, because they're kind of building up. Thank you for becoming a channel member. Much appreciated. Thank you as well, Ezra. Appreciate it. IP, any thoughts about the new shroud X-ray dating, paradigm shift in apologetics? Yeah. So these studies are not new. They came out a few years ago, and they don't prove the shroud dates to 2,000 years ago. They show it's consistent with that hypothesis. So be careful. And they're using a lot of new techniques that have not really been tried yet. I'm waiting to see what critics say. So let's put the brakes on this a little bit. Let's not dive right in. As cool as it would be, we gotta look at this more objectively. So any thoughts on the shroud at all, David?
Well, I think I would say the same thing that Bellarmine said back in the trial of Galileo. I'd say, well, let's wait and see.
Yeah.
And don't jump to any conclusions. I always say to people, if you are a Christian, don't go planting your Jesus flag on some mountain, right? And saying, here's how I know Christianity is true. Bam, when you put it down on some mountain, that you actually don't know yet whether that mountain is real. Because if it turns out that you're wrong, you've just done a big disservice, right? All you've done is made Jesus, made Christians and Jesus look a bit silly, because you backed something before you really knew what the deal was. So, I mean, I just don't know about the shroud, and so I'm not going to be planting any flags there. I'm not planting any Jesus flags on the shroud.
IP atheists are now saying that the argument of evil is irreconcilable, since God just could change the laws of the universe. My understanding is that view is too speculative, actually be taken seriously. What do you think? Yeah, the problem with that line of reasoning is that you're assuming this is somehow a law of the universe and not more of related to logic. If God is going to create free creatures, that's more governed by logic, not physics. So changing the laws of physics isn't going to still deal with the whole issue of evil, which is more of a theological, metaphysical issue than something related to the laws of physics, because these questions about suffering, about triumph, about the place of normative ethics and how it applies to that. These are all metaphysical questions. So check out my video, The Problem of Suffering, a Christian Response, where I go into more detail. And I don't really ever talk about physics because it's like these are metaphysical questions. So that's just missing the mark. It shows you they don't understand philosophy surrounding this. So I wouldn't use that. If they're using that argument, just point out the difference between physics and metaphysics. And anytime God's going to create free creatures, you're going to have the possibility of evil. Doesn't matter what universe it is. Doesn't matter if we're in like a silicone universe or something. It's not gonna work. So that argument just simply doesn't work.
I wonder if this might be something to do with the fact that some Christians have defended God on the grounds of physical suffering in this world by saying, well, you can't have carbon-based life forms on a planet without there being physical pain. Right now, that is a position that some Christians have said. They said, in order for it to be viable for us to live on this planet, the only way you can do it is to incorporate pain into your design. And I think that what I would say is they shouldn't have used that line of argument in the first place. I think that's just a weak line of argument. Christians who are saying, oh, well, God would have liked to have made a world where we didn't feel pain, but he couldn't because he wanted us to be carbon-based. That's just a weak position. It's not a scriptural position. It's a speculative scientific position, and it leaves you open to an attack like this, where someone can say, well, actually, surely God could just change the laws of physics so that you could have carbon-based life and you could have no pain. And they're probably right. So it might be that these people, the atheists that this guy mentions, are attacking a particular Christian position. But that Christian position, I think, is just wrong. I don't think it's right. I think that to try and make an apology for God by saying, well, he had to build pain, is just weak. It's placing a constraint that Scripture doesn't say is there, and it's hard to tell whether it's there scientifically either.
Yeah, and Scripture also says there was a war in heaven, so obviously you can have suffering and conflict without this universe. So. Howdy IP, have you ever considered doing a review of Voltaire's Candide? Yeah, no, it's a very outdated book. I know you're a fan of idealism, and I think it even attacks the Kalam. Well, I mean, like, I don't know a lot of modern atheists that are really bringing up Voltaire's work on this. It seems like it's kind of outdated. If it becomes more popular, I probably would, but right now it's really just not on my radar because I don't see a lot of modern atheists really going to that or using that as like their go-to argument against theism. So I haven't really thought of it. So no. Let's do one more here. We all know that Christians ban books like the Book of the Council of Nicaea. Sneeko said so. Do you know what that's referring to?
Do I know?
Yeah.
No, I don't know, but it looks like it's pretty. I think it must be fairly sarcastic.
Well, no, there was a popular streamer who claimed he was a Christian, devout Christian, and he converted to Islam. His name is Sneeko, and he was on a book talking about this, and someone asked him about somehow the Council of Nicaea come up, and he said on the stream that they banned the Book of the Council of Nicaea from the Bible. So clearly he was getting some things mixed up, and apparently he's never going to live that down. And the only reason people bring it up because he said he was like the devout Christian, and he just studied everything, and he just came to the conclusion Islam was like true. And then he said this after, and we're like, did you really? Were you really a devout Christian? So, yeah, that kind of stuff.
Some helpful principles here. So, or for people for things for people to know. Tertullian, who said, "What has Athens got to do with Jerusalem?" He does mean something by that. He is saying, "Look, you can do this philosophy, but philosophy is not the whole ball game. You need revelation. You need." You need the supernatural, and we have a creed, so he is saying partly what people think he is saying, but he doesn't go anything like as far as I think some folks have made out. So he actually says that Christians should read the classics. So Tertullian actually says that, right? He says you should read the classics, and then this is a continual pattern through the early church. Augustine, for example, talks about gold from the Egyptians. He's referring to the story of the Exodus, where when the Egyptians eventually, when Pharaoh eventually lets the Israelites go, the people in Egypt give their gold to the Israelites as they take them, okay, as they leave. And Augustine says, well, look, that was Egyptian gold, and maybe some of that gold was idols, or maybe some of that gold was dedicated to foreign gods or whatever. But that didn't stop the Israelites from taking it with them. Okay. And he uses that as an analogy, and he says, do you know what? Some of these philosophers from pagan backgrounds or from outside of the church have said some really wise, helpful things. Okay. And so we should read what they say. And he read them all. We should read what they say. And when there are things in there that are helpful, we should hold on to them. It's gold from the Egyptians. It may be coming from outside of the covenant community, but it has value. And that has been the approach of the Christian church all the way through, right? So Cassiodorus, he's a Christian. He implements schooling. He says, you know, what should Christians learn when they go to school? And he builds it almost entirely on Greek and Roman learning. So this was done all the time, and you keep that sort of in that early medieval period, and then you keep going into the medieval period, into the scholastic period, and you have things like Abelard's "sic et non," yes and no, where he again is trying to train people to use classical logic. He's trying to train people to think rationally, be able to argue for a proposition and against it. And if you wanted to be a church minister, you had to be able to go through these problems that Abelard had written down. So examples would be things like the statements in there would be things like, do human beings make their own decisions if God has predetermined them? And it was a requirement that you could answer that question yes, and that you could answer that question no. You were asked to argue both sides, right? And so this idea that they were throwing out philosophy and they were throwing out classical thought is just nonsense. It was treasured, right?
So then let's talk a little bit about, okay, so a lot of this is just mythology. Like you actually go through a lot, and you have a lot of this in your book. Again, let me put that back up there for people that are interested. Where is it? Right here. Okay, so like this is the book we're talking. You go through a lot of examples like flat Earth, other things, but you also talk about in this book a little bit how Christianity actually helped give rise to science. Because really, if you go back to the ancient Greeks, they weren't doing science. They were doing like proto-science, like developing different natural theories of how the world could work and trying to find a very good and consistent one. And then you'd pick apart your opponent's view by showing inconsistencies. But it wasn't modern science. Like, this is what people don't realize, is the ancient Greeks weren't doing like modern science. It comes out of Christian Europe. So like, how did Christianity give rise to modern science? What is your take on this?
Yeah, for science as we would recognize it now to really take off, you have to have a set of underlying assumptions. The conditions have to be right. Okay. And if those conditions aren't right, you're not going to do what we call modern science. And I think that can be quite a subtle concept. So I'd like to give an analogy that might help people understand what I mean by saying, if you're going to do a certain thing, the conditions have to be right first. Okay. So if I said to you, Mike, if I said, give or take an hour, give or take 1 or 2 hours, right? How long have you spent in the last week looking for an elephant in your back garden, would you say?
Oh, probably only 3 or 4 hours. I have not spent that long, right? Just a little bit here and there, you know.
Yeah. Just in gaps.
Just probably 0 minutes, I'd say.
Yeah. Okay. And so you think, well, why? Why haven't you spent any time in your back garden looking for elephants, genuinely looking for elephants? And surely the reason, when you actually think about it, is because you don't think there is an elephant in your back garden. You think the chance of there being an elephant in your back garden is very low. In fact, it probably didn't even cross your mind that there might be an elephant in your back garden. And because of that, you didn't go and look for one, right? But I want you to imagine now a different scenario. Okay, let's say that there is a major accident on one of the big roads near your house. Okay, and it's reported on the news, and you're like, wow, that's a really bad smash. And then a little bit later that day, someone gets in touch with you and they say, look, this is I know this is very strange, but I'm phoning from the zoo. Okay, and we were transporting an elephant, and it was in that crash, right? And it got loose, but we fortunately it's got a radio tag on it, right, which means that we can track it, and we've been tracking it, and it's in your back garden. It's showing up as being in your back garden. Okay. Now you think, hang on, this could be a prank, right? This could be a prank.
Yeah.
But then you notice that on your phone you've got like 5 missed calls from your neighbor, and you think, oh, this is strange, right? And then you hear some pretty odd noises, and they seem to be coming from the direction of your back garden. Okay. What are you going to do? Well, you are probably going to go and look in your back garden for an elephant.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is that the conditions were right. Okay. There's enough going on in the background of what you already now believe about the world. You've had the contact from the zoo. You know about the crash. You've got missed calls from your neighbor. You're hearing noises out back. The way that you view the world and the way you're thinking about the world, now it makes a lot of sense for you to go and look for an elephant. Okay, but without those things, you wouldn't.
Right.
And so that's kind of what happened with Christianity. As Christianity developed intellectually, as its theology developed, and so on, what began to happen is that the conditions began to change. People's intellectual world and what they believed about it began to change. And so I can give you some examples. Okay. And a really good example is Johannes Kepler. He says he reads his Bible. He's a devout Christian. He's living in the late 1500s into the early 1600s. And he says, right, I believe that God made the world. Okay, so I'm living in a created world. I believe that God made me. So he's made the world and he's made me. In other words, my origin and the world's origin are the same. Okay. I also believe that God is rational. He's a rational being. And that his acts, the things that he does, are rational. That would mean that I believe that the things that he makes are rational. So I now think that I live in a rational world. But I also think I must be rational because he made me. Okay. And then Kepler even goes further. He says, I think that the brain, the mind that God has put in my head, is like a mini version of his mind because I'm made in his image.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so he puts all of those things together and he says, right, hang on. If there's a rational God who's made a rational world, who's made a rational me, and my mind is a bit like his mind, then I should be able to go and look at this world and I might actually be able to understand how it works, right? I can think that the world is rational and I can think that I can find the rules and the laws, okay? And a really nice illustration of this is that he notices that the ratio of 2 of the planets, Jupiter and Saturn, of their orbits is the same as the ratio of 2 of the platonic solids if you place them inside each other, right? And he thinks, oh, hang on, there are 5 planets and there are 5 platonic solids. So he thinks, well, do you know what? If I was going to make a solar system, I would do it like that because that's just beautiful. There are only 5 platonic solids. There are 5 planets. This is a mathematically elegant way of doing it. So he devises a model of the solar system that uses this, okay? And it's wrong. But you might say, well, if it's wrong, then aren't you undermining your entire argument? I say, no, it makes the argument even more appealing because what he's doing is he's saying, okay, my hypothesis is that there's a rational God who made me, and that I should therefore be able to determine the orbits of the planets, right? Now he gets it wrong. What does he do? He goes away and he has another crack, and eventually he figures out the correct model of these ellipses, and he comes up with what we now call Kepler's 3 laws of planetary motion. And that's the whole point, isn't it? There are laws. Okay. And that was his hypothesis, that the universe would be rational. So what did Christians believe in the 15 and 1600s? They believed that the world was made ex nihilo. It wasn't made out of any previously existing material, that God made it without any constraints on how he could make it, that God had put laws into it, that it was intelligible, that God had put the ability to deduce those laws into the human mind because he'd made them like him, that what could be known about God, you can actually get to know God by studying his creation, like Romans 1:20, that God was omnipresent, so he was acting everywhere within that universe. And so they put all of these ingredients together, and it births science. C.S. Lewis puts it like this. He says, men became scientific because they expected laws in nature, and they expected laws in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Right?
Right.
And one really interesting example, and quite an unusual one, is there was a chap called Francis Bacon, in the again, same period as Kepler, and he's thinking about the fall, right? And he says, when Adam and Eve fell, there were 2 different types of fall. There was a moral fall; their morals fell, and they became morally corrupt and sinful, and so on. But they also fell mentally. They lost all of their mental acuity. They lost their understanding of nature. They lost their dominion of nature. They just couldn't understand how the world worked anymore. And what Francis Bacon says is, as Christians, we should be trying to undo the damage of the fall, right? God, that's one part of our calling. And he says the way that we undo the moral effect of the fall is to do good deeds, right? We try to be better people. We do charity and so on. And the way we undo the mental effects of the fall is by carrying out science. Okay? That's what he actually says. And he says Christians are therefore duty bound to undo the damage of the fall by pursuing science. And it's actually extraordinary how many people really take this seriously and run with it. There's a guy called Robert Hooke, who was a brilliant physicist, and he invented a very powerful, very effective microscope. And he started looking at things under the microscope. But he actually taught that Adam and Eve would have been able to see those things without a microscope before the fall, right? And then after the fall, they lost that ability, but science was restoring that ability. And so there were all of these scientists doing their job as Christians, saying, look, we are fixing the damage of the fall. So all of these ingredients kind of interweave to produce this perfect set of conditions for people to do science. And if you don't have those conditions in place, if you believe, for example, if a culture believes that the universe is chaotic fundamentally, then that culture will not look for laws in it, right? And of course they won't. Of course they won't look for laws because they don't think there are any laws. They think the universe is fundamentally chaotic, right?
And that was many of the early pagan cultures. I mean, this is why we don't see, like, I think Joseph Needham said, like, science didn't arise in China because they didn't have this lawgiver.
Yeah, that's right. And the same can be true of, if you think about the Greek pantheon, right, or the Egyptian pantheon of gods and so on. If you believe that nature is subject to a vast multitude of gods, and that those gods are unreliable, or they can be in a bad mood, or they can fall out with each other, or they can fall asleep, or they can be tricked, or they can be duped. They're kind of fundamentally unreliable and untrustworthy, and they're often pulling tricks on each other and so on. If you believe that nature is governed by a panoply of gods like that, then again, you don't expect there to be this kind of natural recurring order of laws. So you just don't look for those things in the same way.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember, I think I was reading Noah J. Ephron talk about the fall, kind of like what you were hitting on. And he said, like, because Christians thought they were fallible. They had to do constant experimentation over and over again to make sure the results were right. They couldn't just rely on like their own rational intuitions or their own rational abilities. They wanted to do constant experiment because they knew they were fallible because of the fall. So that is another idea that seeped into science and helped lead to constant experimentation to verify results. So a lot of what we assume just is basic tenets of science actually comes out of the Christian worldview, and people don't even realize it.
Well, you've got very senior figures in the church actively encouraging people to do science. So John Calvin is a good example, no matter what people might think of him in terms of some of the, his attitude sometimes is pretty aggressive. I'm not sure, he would be a fun guy to hang out with all the time. And I think he could be quite unfair and cool. But he was very influential, John Calvin. And he turns up in Draper and White's books, which we'll talk about in a little bit, because I think it's important to talk about those two guys. And you get this quote that says, Calvin said, well, who are you going to trust, Copernicus or the Holy Ghost? Right. And this is the picture of Calvin wading into the geocentrism argument, right, and saying, well, you've got this guy Copernicus who says the sun is in the middle, but the Holy Spirit says the earth is in the middle, and who are you going to go with, right? And that quote turns up in White's great big 2-volume book. It's in there, right? I know because I've read this like 3 times all the way through. And it's in there. And then it turns up again and again and again and again. And if people are watching the video, they can do a Google search for it now. They can say, John Calvin, Copernicus, Holy Ghost. And you're going to find that quote. And it'll be all over the place, right? But Calvin never wrote that. It is a fabricated quote. It wasn't actually White that fabricated it. He found it in another text, but when you try chasing it back earlier, it just disappears. Yeah. And it's not anywhere in Calvin. But what Calvin did say is those Christians who are gifted as astronomers should use that gift for the benefit of the church, because it brings glory to God and it's of great value to humankind. So you've got very significant influential figures actively telling people to be scientific.
Well, we'll get to some super chats in a minute. I see some more have come in, but before we do that, let's start talking about what went wrong, because we see all this ways that the real history of like Galileo, the alleged flat earth belief, the Library of Alexandria, this is all wrong. Christians were teaching the classics. They were continuing to advance science and into the scholastic era as well. Why is it that everyone today thinks that Christianity is at war with science? Like, it is a myth I come across all the time, especially on TikTok, where, it's the new Wild West of bad ideas. It's just, they're just thrown around like all over the place there. So why does everyone think this? It's everywhere.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back in time. Let's go to the late Victorian period. And let's introduce 2 characters. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. And then if it all goes wrong, you can just tell me it's not working. And we'll see whether it's now. I'm already trying to share a window and it's... Oh, here we go. Share. Right.
There we go.
Can you see these?
Oh, yeah, we can see these. Yeah.
Right. So I'm just going to skip to showing you 2 guys. Here we go. So these are the 2 guys that we want to talk about.
Oh.
So the guy on the left, or my left, I don't know how it's hopefully it's going to be the same on everyone's screen, because otherwise the writing is going to be the wrong way around. So the guy on the left, John William Draper, he was born in England, and he moved across to America. He was a chemist, and he was a very, very successful chemist. Very, very clever chap. He took the first ever photograph of the moon. He took the first ever clear photograph of a human face. He worked out that all metals start to emit light at the same temperature, which was quite a surprising fact. It's known as the Draper point. He developed the telegram further technologically and made it more viable financially. And he was very well connected and very well respected. When he died, one obituary said he might be the most significant and important American scientist in all of history, which is quite interesting because it's quite interesting because I suspect now a lot of people just don't know, have never heard of him. Okay, but he was a big deal.
Real proud of himself. Real proud of himself.
Yeah, I mean he was a big deal. In the second half of his life, he became a historian. He became really interested in history, and he wrote these grand sweeping histories, a history of the intellectual development of Europe, and then eventually this history of the conflict between science and Christianity. And then the guy on the right, Andrew Dixon White, he was born in the States a little bit later than Draper, and he was a brilliant academic. He was a literary historian. He was the co-founder of Cornell University, which obviously has gone on to great things. And he was a senator. He was a diplomat. He was everything that he touched turned to gold. He was a real genius, and he was a superb public speaker. Very, very popular. And it's these two guys really who play the major role in people hearing the kind of things that you're talking about. They just don't realize where they came from. They don't realize that they were popularized by Draper and White. So now this is interesting. I'm going to try and stop sharing my screen, but
there you go.
There we go. Am I back now? You can see me.
We're good.
Yeah.
Yep.
So these two guys now, they both called themselves Christians. Okay, they were both described themselves as Christians and as Protestant Christians, and they both thought the Reformation was really, really important. Okay, they saw themselves as being faithful to real Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So what? But in slightly different ways. So what Draper believed was that early Christianity was very pure and uncorrupted. And that Jesus had been this wonderful moral teacher who had helped to connect us to the divine, but that later all of these extra supernatural stories were added, like all the stories of the miracles were added, and the story, and the resurrection was added, and the creeds were added, and he calls them Catholic corruptions, right? And so what he wants to do is return Christianity to its pure state. And in order to do that, you've got to get rid of miracles. You've got to get rid of the divine Christ. You've got to get rid of anything that is supernatural. And it seems in particular that he finds that the supernatural embarrassing. As a scientist, he just thinks, well, miracles are like fairy stories. And really, if we're going to have grown-up Christianity, we've got to abandon all that stuff. How can we expect anybody who's intelligent to really believe these things? But if we help them to realize that actually early Christianity didn't have any of those things, we can turn the clock back and we can get back to where it was supposed to be. Okay, that's what he wants to do. And so he writes his book, and the aim of his book is to point out how silly everything has been from sort of 300 AD onwards. All of this other stuff that he thinks has been gathered into Christianity, but was never part of it at the start. So what does he go after? He goes after stories of miracles. He goes after dogma. He has a very funny passage where he says, did you know that in medieval times there were like 14 different churches that all had a relic that was a finger of the Holy Ghost? So he's sort of making fun of all of these ideas. And the way that he persuades his readers to abandon them is he says they're unscientific. That's how he wants to win his readers. He says, you don't have to believe in miracles because they're unscientific. You don't have to believe in all this extra stuff because it's unscientific. Science is good. Religion is bad. Throw all that stuff out and get back to how it is supposed to be, true Christianity, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm following you.
Okay. What about Andrew Dixon White? Well, Andrew Dixon White has got a slightly different idea. he takes evolutionary theory, which is very popular at the time, and he says, I don't want to just apply that to species. That applies to everything. Everything is evolving. Everything is improving, right? And he therefore says that religion evolves. Okay, he wants to apply it to religion as well. And so he says there is a true religion, but we're not there yet. Like there is a Christianity is like the thread that is taking us towards the truth over time. And so at the time of Jesus, Jesus was the right guy to follow. But that was 2,000 years ago. We've evolved since then. Okay. And so we don't need all that stuff anymore. We've advanced beyond it. What we need is somebody else to come along and take us to the next step. And he basically thinks he's the guy to do that. Right?
He's the Messiah.
Yeah, that's right. And so how is he going to persuade his readers of this kind of evolutionary path? He's going to say, well, look at all these stupid things that people have done in the name of religion. And that way I can show you that over time we're progressing, right? And so he tells all these stories too. And so they end up telling these stories for slightly different reasons. Draper wants to turn the clock back to original pure Christianity. Andrew Dixon White wants to accelerate everything towards one day what will be the ultimate truth about the universe, right? They both call themselves followers of Jesus because Andrew Dixon White says, well, Jesus was a good guy and he was the right guy and his attitude was right and he was on the right path. And Draper says, oh, he was a really good moral teacher who helped out, you know, and was telling the truth about reality. But we've got to uncover that truth again. We've got to get back to that truth again. But what that results in is these books where they tell these stories. So they say, oh, look, for example, Christianity taught everybody that the earth was flat. Okay. Mm-hmm. Until Columbus went and sailed around it, and then they had to admit defeat. But we know that's not true. We know that all the way through all of AD history, people have known that the world was a globe, right? You sometimes see these paintings, and they can be very ancient, of a ruler or some kind of monarch holding in one hand a staff, and in the other hand, they're holding a golden ball, right? With like a cross on the top of it usually. And you've seen I'm sure that all of your listeners will have seen these pictures. Well, the staff represents that they're the ruler, right? Yeah. What does the ball represent? Well, the ball represents the earth. Mm-hmm. They are a ruler over the earth, right? Although ultimately it's Christ's earth, which is why there's often a cross on the top. It's not a flat disc in those images, right? They didn't think the earth was flat. If they thought the earth was flat, then what would they be holding in this hand? They would be holding a flat image for the earth, right? But they're holding a ball. And in the medieval period, the go-to textbook about the earth was called The Sphere. It was by John. it was by John Sacrobosco. Everybody studied it in monasteries and universities, and it's literally called The Sphere. There are only two people in all of Christian history who claim that the earth was flat in writing. And I think you know who they were because I saw you talking about it with David Wood, Lactantius and Cosmas. Mm-hmm. Lactantius was Alexander the Great's tutor.
You mean Constantine?
Oh, Constantine's tutor. That's right. And he was a convert, and a lot of people said about him, look, he's a lovely guy, but he doesn't really know what he's talking about. And they kind of laughed him off. And then there's Cosmas in Decoplustes, which means sailed to India. And he writes about it, and he just reads the book of Hebrews and gets completely the wrong end of the stick. He thinks that when Hebrews is talking about the tabernacle, that it's talking about the structure of the earth. So he actually thinks the earth is this giant, like, cuboid. And people are literally laughing at him in his own lifetime. The church didn't teach that the earth was flat, but both Draper and White said that they did. Because they need the church to be embarrassing. They need it to be unscientific for their own agendas, right?
Yeah.
And then they say, oh, it banned dissection, which it didn't. Dissection was banned by the ancient world, and then the church legalized it. So that story is upside down.
Yeah, they'll try to bring up that idea that Leonardo da Vinci was like dissecting in his basement, and it's like the guy was an artist. He wasn't like a qualified medical examiner. It'd be like finding out your next door neighbor's examining dead bodies in his basement. You're gonna be like, hold on, I'm calling the police. It's Leonardo da Vinci was kind of in the same boat. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, in the ancient world, and it's hardly surprising that dead bodies were considered to be very weird things, right? They're kind of sort of sacred in some way. They're very unsettling in other ways. They're unclean in other ways. So basically, you didn't go cutting people open to look inside them, right? And that didn't happen in the Greek world. It didn't happen in the Roman world. It was banned.
Or the Islamic world. They were very much against that. Yeah,
that's right. It's all banned. And then it's only under the auspices of Christianity in sort of the 12th century and so on that you first start to see autopsies and dissections being carried out for scientific reasons. Now, some of those scientific reasons are a little bit laughable. Like there's one autopsy on record where they dissected a saint to try and figure out what had made them so holy, right? What was the secret of their holiness, and was there something different inside their body that? But Catherine Park, who's at Harvard, she says that basically, if people wanted to dissect, they would approach the church, and the church would give permission or not give permission. And she said that in every single case she'd ever come across, the church had given permission. But again, Draper and White tell that story. They say, oh, the church banned all these things. Now, in some ways, they're being lazy, because quite often they are getting their information from an earlier source, but they haven't checked that source, right? And then when you chase it back, you find out that these things just simply aren't true. For example, Draper's source for Columbus being told he shouldn't sail around the world because he'll fall off the edge is actually a novel. His source is a novel by Washington Irving, who wrote Sleepy Hollow. Washington Irving wrote a book about Columbus, which he wrote as a historical novel. And when he went to the library to do his research, he found that there just wasn't enough drama in it for his liking. So he actually invented some scenes in which he had bishops telling Columbus, no, don't do it. Don't do it. You'll sail off the end of the world. But he's put it into a novel.
Are you telling me Sleepy Hollow is not history? I'm starting to doubt you now. That sounds like that was actually what happened.
Yeah. Well, but then see what Draper quotes Irving, but as reality, and then other people come in and they quote Draper, but they don't say this is from Washington Irving's novel. They say this is from this amazing history written by John William Draper, this respected historian, scientist. And so these things start to gain credence in these books. And there's another guy, I'm just going to try and show you, well, another two guys. I'm going to try again, and we'll see whether this is going to work again. Let me, I have to open it up for, sorry.
Should be, yeah, just go and open it up. It should come right up.
Yeah. Although actually, oh, hang on. Your audience should know that I've never used this program before. You thrust something on me right at the last minute, but I'm doing it.
Everyone uses StreamYard now. It's like the go-to streaming software.
Well, I guess I'm just not one of the cool kids. Here we go. Right. So if I go down here, let's get rid of that, make it a bit bigger. There's two more people that are worth mentioning. And I'm hoping they're going to show up. Here we go. Right. So these two people are worth knowing about. Edward Youmans and George Sarton. So Edward Youmans was himself an atheist, right? He just wanted to get rid of religion altogether. And he worked in the publishing industry. And guess which two books he published, amongst others? Well, he published both Draper and White. Okay, he published both of them. So he really knew what he was doing. He could see in their writing, even though Draper and White themselves thought that they were doing Christianity a favor, Youmans read their stuff and thought, right, if I can publish this and it's really going to get rid of Christianity once and for all. So he is like, he's appropriating their work. And he was a very, very clever man, very savvy man. And as a result, the books were bestsellers on both sides of the Atlantic. Draper's was translated into 24 different languages, and they were on the bestseller lists for like 50 years. Everybody had these books. And then the guy on the right, George Sarton, is hugely important in the history of science as a discipline. When he was a younger man, he asked the question, how come we've got history of literature and we've got history of poetry and we've got history of nations and all these things, but we don't have any history of science? You can't study the history of science anywhere. And he thought that that was ridiculous, that it should be possible to study the history of science. So he started setting it up as an academic discipline in its own right at Harvard University. And he therefore trained up the first ever cohort of science historians in the 1900s, in the early 1900s. And what did he use as one of his main texts? He used Andrew Dixon White's book. So what happens is that you get the first generation of history of science academics are told all these things from White's book. And then what do? They go off to other universities and they start their own history of science departments. And so you have this completely new academic discipline that spreads out, and the story it spreads out with is the story of the conflict between history and science. And so it's there right from the very beginning of the actual discipline itself. Are we back? Am I back?
Yeah, you're back. Yeah, you're here.
Sorry, could you not see the image of those two guys? Or
oh no, they were up there. I got them.
They were up there. Okay. And so that's why it becomes so widespread and so deeply held. And you can say about these TikTok people, I'm really fed up with them. I'm really fed up with them because of them repeating all this stuff. But one of the reasons they're repeating it is that it's in textbooks.
Yeah.
It's in libraries. It's in revision material. It's in films. It's in Senate hearings. It's in academic journals. It's everywhere because it got into academia really quite deeply. And so even though modern historians of science have picked it apart, that hasn't seeped into the popular consciousness at all, right? And so therefore, I know that it's frustrating to keep hearing it again and again and again. But I think you've got to understand that when people do say these things, they often have got it from pretty decent sources in terms of headlines, right? Like they've got it from the BBC, or they've got it from, like I said, I found it in the British Library. You can get it from public intellectuals like Neil deGrasse Tyson and so on. So it's not like they're picking it up from nowhere. People are hearing these things from reputable sources, and requiring them to do a bit more digging is often, I think, wishful thinking. Because if you already think to yourself, well, the reason I don't believe in God is that I believe in science, if that's already your line of thinking, and then you come across a story like Alexandria, or you come across a story like the flat Earth and so on, well, that fits, doesn't it? It fits with what you already think. You've heard it from a decent source. Why are you going to dig any deeper? Why are you going to look any further? You haven't got a great deal of motivation to do it. And so my hope is that with a book like our one that is written in the popular style and written to be fun, written for anybody to pick up and read, whether they've got a background in science or theology or history or anything, it doesn't matter whether you've got that background. It's a book of stories, and like it's almost like a kind of whodunit. Then hopefully that's how you start to win people back. You win people back by just making it interesting. People love conspiracy theories. They love debunkings. You can say, well, isn't it actually quite interesting that the idea of Columbus sailing off the Earth came from a novel? When in actual fact, everybody already thought the Earth was round? I mean, that's actually quite interesting, right?
Yeah. Just so everyone knows, the book is linked below. If anyone is interested in getting it, I highly recommend it. It is definitely written for a layman audience. So it's not too technical. It's really interesting. It's got a good flow to it.
And you do pick up a lot of really good facts, a lot of good quotes you can use in this kind of stuff to deal with this stuff. Because I get emails all the time of people asking me, my cousin was over for Thanksgiving and he brought up the fact that, oh, Galileo was basically burned at the stake and tortured for doing science. This would be a good go-to book for that, or tell them to read it or get it for them and challenge them to actually go through this stuff. Because you're right, is that this is a really good story that people cling to. It's Christianity evil, science good, Christianity villain. And people don't want to let go of this story because they think it just sounds so cool. So they keep pushing it, even though it's just based on utter nonsense.
Yeah. Well, it's an easy story to believe, right? It's an easy story to believe because it's simple. Here are all these brave scientific thinkers having these brilliant ideas and trying to change the world. And then here are these baddie bishops coming in and saying, no, you're going against my holy book, and then doing, dreadful things to them to hold them back. And if it hadn't been for religion, we'd be on Alpha Centauri already. That's a very easy story to believe. It is an easy story to believe. It's just that it's completely wrong. It's actually backwards. It's actually completely backwards. And Friedrich Nietzsche, who's like the arch atheist, he says that all of our scientific thinking in the modern age was birthed in the crucible of Christian thought. Right? That's what he says himself. And he, like I said, he's an atheist. He. It's not that he doesn't have an axe to grind. It's that he very much does have an axe to grind, but he still doesn't go after Christianity in terms of science. He says Christianity birthed modern science.
Yeah. So moral of the story is, if you actually go through the real history, ladies and gentlemen, especially if you get this book, it will really help you. Christianity gave rise to modern science. It was crucial for its development. 1900s, two guys came along, wrote these horrible books that just pretended there was this great war between Christianity and science, got picked up by atheist apologists, and then it becomes basically mainstream. And the worst thing is that while all that is going on, while they're spreading this myth of the conflict, meanwhile, Christians, John Suckham Jr. and Henry Morris, published the Genesis flood, and they started pushing this myth that Christianity always taught young earth creationism. And, historians today, like Ronald Numbers, say that was also nonsense, but that also spread like wildfire. So you have these two wildfire things going on, and that's why we have all these myths today.
Well, I think that what can happen is that if you keep telling people that they've always been at war, they start to believe it, right? And that can happen on both sides. Imagine growing up in a country where you have been told right from birth, we've always been at war with this other country, right? Well, you would actively start to dislike that other country because you've always been at war with them. And then actually, you know what? That might actually cause some wars. So you have this really ironic position where this fabricated conflict that supposedly was in the past but isn't real, has actually gone on to cause real conflict now.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's kind of what we're seeing now, is a lot of like Christians actually are actively against science because they've been told. And so it's kind of like, here's an interesting analogy. In the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln said, "I'm not going to end slavery. I promise." The South, the Southern states said, "No, we know you are. We're rebelling." And then the Civil War started. And halfway through the Civil War, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation to revitalize the war effort because the North wasn't doing well. The South created its own enemy. They created its own nightmare that wouldn't have happened if they wouldn't actually rebelled. That's kind of what we see now. You see all these people like Jerry Coyne saying the religion is always against us with science. We're always at war with each other. And therefore, there's a lot of fundamentalists that grow up going, yeah, you're right. You're always attacking us. We must be at war. They've kind of created their own monster.
Yeah, that's right. The false conflict in the past, the belief in a false conflict has created a real one now. And I mean, I had an extraordinary experience when I was a student at university. I grew up in quite a small evangelical church where there weren't really any other teenagers. It was pretty parochial in some ways. And then when I went to university, I joined the Christian Union, and there were all these other Christians there who came from like other churches. And at first I thought, wow, God, thank you for sending me here to correct all of these heretics. You know, I'm going to be such a blessing to these guys as I point out all these secondary doctrines that they're getting wrong. And then over time, I started to realize, hey, some of these people have really thought this stuff through, and they seem to know more things than me. And maybe they're right, and maybe I'm wrong. And so one of the outcomes of that was that I started trying out or attending every now and then other churches, right? Just to get a different feel, different flavor, start different teaching, and broaden my horizons a little bit. And one church that I went to once was it was in a barn, right? And it was absolutely bonkers. I went into this barn. There was someone playing the accordion. There were people rolling around on the floor. It was like madness. I'd not really seen anything like it before. And I didn't really know what to make of it. And about halfway through the service, a guy said, "If you want more of God, come to the front." And I thought, well, I do want more of God. I think this is all a little bit strange, but, you know, I'm going to try and be open-minded about this. You know, they are talking about Jesus and so on. So I went to the front, and the guy put his hands on me, and he said, "I'm going to pray for you to receive the gift of tongues." And he put his hands on me, and he started praying for me, and then he pushed me. And nothing really happened because he was about 5'2". And then he said, "Speak in tongues." And I couldn't, right? So, and then he said, "It's not working." And I said, I can tell it's not working. And then he said, "What do you do?" I said, "Well, I'm a student." He said, "What do you study?" And I said, "I study physics." And then he said, he said, "That's the issue. Your physics is getting in the way." Right. So according to this particular guy, you know, this guy who was helping to head up a Christian meeting, he was actually saying, you know, the Holy Spirit cannot work in you because you're a physicist. Now, that is almost certainly an outcome from the conflict thesis.
Yeah.
Right? Because the idea that someone in 1820 or 1750 would have said the Holy Spirit can't work in you because you're a scientist is ridiculous. It wouldn't have crossed anyone's mind to say that.
Mm-hmm.
You say it now because you've imbibed the conflict thesis, that it's science versus religion. You've swallowed the pill, and now you think that science and religion are opposed. I've got a friend called Nathan Bosser. In fact, it's worth showing you what he says, because I think it's really worth listening to. I'm gonna try this again. So do you want to fill for a minute while I try?
Yeah, I'll do some super chats here. Hi, great response to Dan McClellan. I wonder, could a prophecy about end time spoken by Jesus to his disciples mean that he meant his resurrection? So great question. Yeah, you can see the response I just posted to Dan on X. It's on TikTok. It's on Instagram. I suspect he'll respond again, and then I will just keep this going, because the more attention he gives me, the better. I grow every time he does. I don't know why he does it. No, I don't. It could be something. It's about the destruction of the temple in 780. I'm just not convinced by that. I think it's a conditional prophecy, so it comes with delays.
Okay, I'm ready. If you're ready, or do you...
Yep, let's do it.
Okay, so this is a friend of mine, Nathan. He's a historian of science, but I think it's worth looking at what he says. When he was speaking to me, when I was writing the book, and I was chatting with him, and he wanted to have some input in it. And he says this, having, just in case the font size is too small, I'm going to read it out as well. Having grown up in an African church, I have seen that one of the problems with the conflict thesis is that it has implicitly and explicitly hindered Black Christians from engaging with science in various ways, because there's an inherent notion that science is against their faith. This was certainly the case for me for a long time. Dismantling the conflict thesis would, I think, help Black churches and individuals to engage more positively with science in relation to their beliefs. So you can see what he's saying here. He's saying, look, the conflict thesis didn't just get into academia. Draper and White didn't just get into academia. They managed to get into the church as well. And because they've got into the church, Christians have backed off on science. And his experience, Nathan's experience of being in a black church, was that this was particularly strong for him when he was growing up. And he thought of science as being bad and scientists as being the bad guys. Now, fortunately, he was able then to emerge past that, and he's become a historian of science, and written all about this sort of thing. And he does have quite a hopeful message as well. He says this: there's certainly no inherent reason as to why the conflict thesis cannot be overturned. The literature, by which he means the academic literature, has already largely dismantled it. But now younger scholars are increasingly working to push this beyond the academic sphere by utilizing the new tools of the internet age. Thomas Huxley, who was a friend of Draper and White and very influential in the UK about the conflict thesis, Thomas Huxley trained up his succeeding generation to perceive conflict between science and theology. But today, we can train our succeeding generations to understand that the relationship is far more positive than that. And I would actually say, look, even if you're an atheist, right, and you think you've got some skin in the game here and it suits you to be anti-religion and pro-science, no, you need to think about the reality of what that is actually doing, right? And so Rebecca McLaughlin, she says the narrative that presents science as antithetical to Christianity is part of what is keeping underrepresented groups like African Americans and Latino Americans and women out of the sciences, right? So one of the things that the sciences have been trying to do more is say, look, there's some real underrepresentation in science and we want to tackle it, right? Well, one of the reasons that there is this underrepresentation is that you're missing out on people with religious faith, right? And you're missing out on people with religious faith because you've told them the conflict thesis. And statistically, if you're missing out on people with religious faith, that means you're actually more likely to be missing out on women. You're more likely to be missing out on people of color and so on. So actually, do you know what? We can improve representation in the sciences by telling people that the conflict thesis is a load of rubbish. Even if you're an atheist, like even if you're an atheist, it's still in your favor to say, but look, this is false history. It's just not true. And actually, you know what? We want everybody involved in the sciences. We might be missing out on an awful lot of really good scientists because we're drumming the conflict thesis drum. And surely nobody wants that, right? Whether they're a Christian or an atheist or anybody else. Surely people don't want. No one wants people not going into science because of a false idea of history.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I appreciate you bringing that up, that a lot of this has just been manufactured. It's not real. I think it will eventually go away. Actually, we're having a lot of fun online using a lot of the data you guys have been presenting for us in your books and the same to just go after the proponents of the conflict thesis. And a lot of them just kind of like end with their jaw drops. They don't know how to deal with this because they've just been lied to. So we're making a lot of progress. I can assure you that. Hopefully it just keeps going, and hopefully the conflict thesis does go where it belongs, which is to the trash bin. But only time will tell. It's hard to get rid of a good story. I believe I heard you say once. So, I mean, that's right. Yeah. This is something that we need to really keep fighting over. So,
yeah, you got to give people a better story, right? Like a more powerful story. And the idea that two people you've never heard of wrote two books that you've never heard of and fooled the entire world by doing it is a pretty good story, right? Like this is the most successful conspiracy theory of all time. They fooled almost the entire world.
Excellent. All right, we'll get to some super chats here. Hey, IP, I want to hear your opinion on the new evidence for the Shroud of Turin being dated to the time of Christ. Yeah, we talked about this earlier in the stream. We got another super chat on it. So go back and check that out. Similar things I'd just say there. Off topic, but would a philosophy degree make a good foundation for an eventual master's of divinity, or would you recommend something else? Keep in mind, my local college doesn't have any religion classes. No, philosophy would be a great degree for that. It's good to go into something like that. You get a foundation. You can spot fallacies easier. It teaches you how to reason. You get a good foundation for a lot of the philosophical disciplines. I would highly recommend that. I wish a lot of biblical scholars would take philosophy classes because they use fallacies way too much and don't even realize it. Like, it's ridiculous how much I come across.
I think this is a good example of where the medieval world was ahead, right? Like the medieval world said, look, if you want to do divinity, you have to do philosophy first. The idea of you studying divinity without having studied philosophy was just impossible. You could not do it. You literally could not do it. And we've lost that because we live in this increasingly specialized world where we're asking people at younger and younger ages to say, right, for the whole of the rest of my life, all I'm going to study is this one thing, right? So this person here, the advice that I would give in the way that the world is set up now with its specialization is to say some things you can learn as a hobby and other things you really need to properly study, right? And so I would say, for example, with philosophy, actually really studying it is probably significantly more helpful than having it as a hobby. Physics is the same. If you want to get good at physics, you probably should study it, right? And philosophy is going to help you with anything else that you go on to do because it's teaching you how to think. And physics is very similar too. It's teaching you ways to think, and then you use it in all sorts of other areas. Well, go on, carry on. That's right, you carry on.
Oh, no, I thought that was a great point. Yeah, and that's one of the things is I tell people is philosophy is kind of like the basis of all knowledge. Like anytime someone's making an inference, they're doing philosophy. So whether it's biblical scholarship, it's in science, they're doing philosophy and they don't even realize it. Asking this for the guy in the chat, could you address the argument that heliocentrism was declared heretical in 1616?
Yeah, okay. So what happened was that Galileo was told he couldn't teach it as a fact.
Yeah.
There was no issue with him teaching it as a viable theory. And in and around that time, there are a bunch of different theories. There's also Tycho Brahe's theory that is sort of heliocentric and sort of not. It's like a hybrid. Basically, people were in the position where, because of telescopes, you've got a massive technology change because of telescopes, and you've got a massive mathematical shift because of what Copernicus noticed. And people were trying to put together the new information they were getting through the telescope and the new concept of treating it mathematically. Galileo was allowed to carry on teaching heliocentrism, but he wasn't allowed to teach it as the default position, the go-to position, the truth, right?
Yeah, they didn't want him to be so dogmatic. The church didn't want Galileo to be dogmatic, guys. They wanted him to be open to the evidence and the actual facts. So kind of an irony of history.
Yeah.
What atheists say Christianity makes people stupid. I think he meant when. I always ask, then why did so many early Christians have an education in philosophy and other concepts as well? Yeah, that's a good point. And there's no evidence it actually makes people stupid. I did a video with a psychologist about a year or so ago on this whole topic. Does Christianity make people stupid, or are atheists smarter? I think was the title of the video. And we just went through the actual data. They said, no, neither or. These are just correlative beliefs that doesn't actually go one way or the other. So you can want more, you check out that video.
I think there are times when there are either churches or there are schools of thought within Christianity that do discourage people asking questions. And that is just really unhelpful. It's not scriptural. The Bible has got, on average, if you work it out, the Bible has got 3 questions per chapter, right? Across the Bible. That's a useful stat to know. For those of you who know your Bibles, you know that chapters aren't really that long in the Bible. And on average, there are 3 questions per chapter. So if you're doing biblical Christianity, you should be asking questions all the time, right? And who asked more questions than anybody else? Jesus is constantly asking questions. In fact, often when he is asked a question, his answer is another question, right? So we should be like that. That's what Christians should be like. And so I think, this person here, when it says when an atheist says this, I always ask, well, you're nailing it, right? That's exactly that's what Jesus did. So somebody asks you a question, you reply with another question. And often you'll find that if you do ask good questions, you're just pulling on the threads of their worldview bit by bit. And if you ask the right questions, you're just asking them to explain their position. Then quite often you'll find that those threads start to pull the whole thing apart. And it can come apart. And you haven't even had to make any points yourself.
Right.
All you've done is ask.
How can I explain to other believers that theistic evolution isn't taking God out of creation, but just another way of how God created things? Well, in my experience, there's two ways to look at it. You got to look at it from how evolution is compatible with Christianity and how Christianity is compatible with evolution. And you got to show that, evolution is not just this random chaotic process necessarily. There can be aspects of structuralism in it that could bring about certain forms from not from design would be the right word, but from the natural laws. So check out a video I did called "Was Evolution Inevitable?" where I talk about how there are self-assembly processes. And then you get to look at the other way. People have questions about Genesis, like does it really say that God created everything in 6 literal days? And you go through my Genesis 1 through 11 series, and you can get answers to that in there. So you got to actually deal with the individual questions when it comes to this topic, because that's where people are going to get lost. They get lost in the weeds on this one.
Yeah, and I think also you've got to keep the main thing. So it is, I think it's pretty difficult. I'm not a biologist, okay, but I think we're in a period of history that is actually quite similar to the geocentrism, heliocentrism period of history, where discoveries have been made that people weren't expecting, and theories have been put forward that people weren't expecting. That's just caught everybody off guard, right? We thought we knew what was going on, and now we're not quite so sure. And so I sort of wonder whether, in the same way that we look back on the geocentrism and heliocentrism now as Christians, and we say, well, there's no problem. But while they were in the middle of it, there was a problem, and nobody, there was some missing science, and there was some missing biblical interpretation, right? Those two things were both missing in that period of history, because it took a while to figure it out. And I think we just happen to be living through a period of history like that, where biblical scholars are looking at the relevant texts and scientists are looking at the relevant data. And I think that people are a little bit puzzled about how this is all going to end up fitting together. And if we get another 200 years down the road and Jesus hasn't come back, then maybe people will look back on this period of history. Christians will look back on this period of history and say, what's the problem? Because it all makes sense. But I think it's fair to say, I personally think that this is like a problematic area. It's a confusing area. It feels like not all the science has been gathered yet. It feels like there are some passages that we're not quite sure how to interpret in the best way. And I do think it is quite puzzling. But you don't need to be frightened. You don't need to be frightened of that being puzzling, right? All truth is God's truth. It's all going to work out in the end. And I would be wary of anybody who says, well, I've got it all figured out. I know exactly what happened, and I can tell you. I just don't think we do know exactly what happened. But we know that God is the creator, and that his word is true when we interpret it correctly. And we also know that when we do good science, we're going to get the correct answers. And that's basically what Galileo said in his letter to the Grand Duchess Christina. He said, look, when we read the Bible, if we read it properly, we'll get the truth. Okay. But if we misread it, we'll end up arguing for something that's wrong. And when we do science, we'll get the right answers. Okay. And so, I think we should take the Galileo approach there and say, it's going to be okay, right? Keep doing the science. Keep reading your Bible and praying. It is all going to make sense at some point. I hope that helps anyway.
Yeah. What would you say to the claim that evolution is incompatible with God due to the seemingly undesigned and random mutation adaptations that happen? Well, this is what I was just kind of talking about. It may not be like neo-Darwinism is not really the standard anymore. It's incomplete. And so like Cy Gart talked about an extended evolutionary synthesis. So there's other evolutionary processes, and we found things like self-assembly processes. So evolution may be more of this a complicated scheme of different processes. And some scientists are moving more towards a structuralist understanding. So it's not so much this idea of like random changes, is that there's nature has certain structures imbued that it will bring about naturally. So they talk about like different niches. Animals fill different niches, and we constantly see convergent evolution. So like we'll see large grass eating or plant eating mammals similar to large plant eating dinosaurs that were once here, and some have long necks. So you have like the giraffe and the brachiosaurus. Different animals keep filling these different niches because nature fine tunes evolution to go along certain paths. This is why we see the three-toed sloth and the two-toed sloth. They're not related on the evolutionary tree, yet they evolve the same form. Camera eyes, what the eyes we have, evolved multiple times in evolutionary history. So we see this. And there's a great book called The Runes of Evolution, written by Simon Conway Morris. And he basically gives all this evidence of convergent evolution, arguing that evolution may be fine-tuned to bring about certain forms. So it may not be this totally random process.
Yeah, also you could look up the work of Dr. or Professor Ard Louis at Oxford University. He's a professor of theoretical physics, a friend of mine, and very, very switched on guy. He's been looking at computational models of evolution or analogous evolution. And he's able to show, there are certain outcomes that are just overwhelmingly more likely than others. So it is possible for a process to be random and yet produce a very, very predictable outcome. And a simple way of understanding this would be, imagine that you've got one coin and you're going to flip it, right? If you flip one coin, it's 50-50 whether you're going to get heads or tails. So it's random, right? Let's call that randomness. But if you say, right, well, what am I going to get if I flip 100 coins? Okay. Well, that becomes way easier to predict. You say, well, I'm going to get somewhere around about 50 heads and 50 tails. I know that I'm not going to get 10 heads and 90 tails, right? That's just not going to happen. And so a process can be random and highly predictable, right? In fact, our life is based on that. Like the processes that happen in our bodies. As a physicist, I can tell you that every atom in our body is undergoing Brownian motion, right? Brownian motion is random. So every atom in our body is effectively moving randomly. And yet some outcomes are so overwhelmingly more likely than others that we remain alive. In fact, it's Brownian motion that is powering the action in our cells and so on. So calling something undesigned and random, I think can lead you to a false idea of it also being out of control. Those things aren't the same. And then also, does that mean that it's incompatible with God? Well, you'd have a problem then, wouldn't you? Because every board game that uses dice is suddenly incompatible with God, right? Because oh no, you're playing a game and someone's about to roll a dice, and who knows what's going to happen? Okay, so there's no God. Well, that doesn't follow. It may well, but like I said, I don't think we really know what's going on with these processes. But it's certainly quite possible that that evolution has this kind of randomness to it, but that God is very carefully bringing about what he wants to bring about.
I remember reading somewhere from John Lennox that Galileo also translated certain books for the commoners, which the Pope didn't like. Am I wrong?
I've not heard that.
I haven't either, no.
But that, obviously, all I can say is I haven't heard it. And maybe you could Google it.
Yeah, I don't know if that's accurate or not. I've not heard anything, so I don't think that is. So yeah, I would maybe try to look it up on your own, but it does not sound right to me. So thank you for becoming a channel member. Much appreciated. Does John Lennox have enough scholarly support for his cosmic temple view? Answers in Genesis and other young Earth websites are saying he doesn't and have to be taken seriously. Okay, well, that's an ad populum just because it may not have as much support. Does not mean it's wrong, but also he has getting more support, like Tremper Longman, Robert E. Homestead supports it, and a lot of younger scholars seem to be leaning in that direction. So yeah, it's one of those things. It's like sometimes it just takes a while for the old guard to die out and new people come in and pick up a theory or a similar thing like that. But I wouldn't even say it's wrong just because of that. It's about what the data shows.
Yeah, there was I think it was a podcast this week from William Lane Craig and Ken Keithley about a new book that's come out on 4 views of Adam.
Yeah.
And on that podcast, I think Bill commented on the fact that John Walton's model is not even presented in the book. So maybe it has fallen off a little bit. But I haven't read the book that they were talking about. Again, what I would say is keep the main thing the main thing. It's fine to keep asking these questions. It's fine, and we should do that. But do not add it to your status, right? Do not say, I'm a Christian, and therefore I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that he died, that he rose again on the 3rd day, and that John Walton's view of the cosmic temple is true, right? Like, you don't need to add a position on any of those things to the heart of the gospel. And when you're talking to your friends, maybe these things can come up in conversation, sure, but when they come up, they've got to be secondary. Because if you witness to someone and you insist that John Walton is right, and then it turns out he's not, then you've undermined all the other things you did tell them that were right.
Yeah. Thoughts on the Taupoit tombs? Okay, so check out Craig Evans' book, Fabricating Jesus. He's got a whole chapter on them, and basically showed they're nonsense. This is not the tomb of Jesus. So I'd recommend that. Good source, Fabricating Jesus by Craig Evans. Do you think there will be science in heaven? I've been told that when we get to heaven, all questions will be answered. That idea is sad to me. Okay. As I said, many questions regarding this. I don't know. Haven't been there. I'd also remind you, heaven is actually going to be the resurrection here on earth, where we'll live forever. And I would argue spread out through the universe. So yes, because I think we're going to be spreading Eden to all planets eventually in the resurrection. That's my theory. But haven't been there, can't say. Maybe one day we'll find out.
Yeah, I think
have you been there, David? Can you give us some insight? Because people keep asking me about heaven and various questions, and I'm like, I don't know.
Well, I live in Yorkshire, so I'm pretty close actually to heaven. I think that there's way more continuity. A biblical picture of heaven has got way more continuity in it than the sort of idea of sitting around on clouds playing harps. Or standing in some eternal worship service. That it is it's going to be a lot like this, right? It's going to be a lot like this. Don't forget that when God made the world, he said it was good. How do you feel when you go walking in a beautiful landscape, right? You feel overwhelmed with it and the beauty of it. And so there'll be a lot of continuity. And I'm a scientist. I suppose I'm happy either way. It wouldn't surprise me at all if we are still studying and learning about God's majesty and the things he can do and how he does them. If there isn't science in heaven, then I can tell you for a fact I won't miss it because I will be blissfully happy.
Right. Yeah. I think it's a good way to put it. Thank you, Ellie, for the very, very generous super chat. Much appreciated. Miss you as well. I'll be back in Florida, I believe, in March for the next conference down there. So hopefully you can make it. Sneeko, apparently the real Sneeko, says, IP, why are you running? Do you feel my powerful dawa? Good luck defending child marriage without the Book of Nicaea. It's never, the joke is never going to die. I'm telling you, it's going to haunt him for his life. How to overcome anger. I have so many violent thoughts and unforgivable fantasy. It scares me. I constantly feel how I reject the gospel. Pray for me. Yeah, we definitely will. I would say, remember what Paul said in Galatians. He contrasts works of the flesh with fruit of the spirit. You can't force fruit to grow. I think he's doing this contrast on purpose. He doesn't do weeds of the flesh. He does fruit of the spirit and works of the flesh. Because works are something we do. Fruit can only grow if we get the right conditions. We have to get the right water, or the right soil, the right sunlight, and then fruit grows. Likewise, you need to put yourself in the right environment and the right conditions. Are you watching violent movies? Stop. Are you listening to angry music? Stop. I used to have a lot of road rage, and then I switched to listening to more worship music, and my road rage declined. You got to do that kind of stuff in your own life. You go with that. So maybe you're not in a good church. Find a good prayer group, a good Bible study. Get around people that are not going to bring those emotions out. Are you playing violent video games and it's affecting you? So think about those kinds of stuff and start putting yourself in the right environments.
Yeah, I could not agree more. It is everything you said is right, and pray. Pray a lot. God can bring about transformation, dramatic transformation in people's lives, and Jesus encourages us to pray with persistence. And sometimes people experience very quick change, and other people experience change over a longer period of time. But pray, and I mean, can we pray for this guy now, or guy or girl now?
Sure. Yeah.
I don't know how to say the name, but we pray for this person. Father God, will you calm their spirit and take away their anger, and help them to experience a real change in their life that is an encouragement to them and an encouragement to others. Amen.
Amen. If you want to talk about science and faith, how about calling out the growing problem of Catholic exorcists lying about seeing kids crawl up walls? Listen, a lot of that stuff could be hearsay. We're not going to deny we're not going to deny the existence of demonic powers. Now, I would say, as the kingdom of Christ spreads, we should see far, far less of this, because the kingdom is spreading, and therefore these demons should be cast out just by the presence of the Holy Spirit. But how are we going to? There's just a lot of it's just reports we're hearing. It's okay. I heard it. What am I supposed to do now? I'm not going to promote it. I'm also not going to. It's clearly a fact. Like we take these case by case basis, and sometimes the most we can do is go, "Hey, I heard it, but I can't verify it or not. What do you want me to do?"
Yeah, I would want to know what does this person mean about calling out? Like, are they asking you to say that you know these things aren't true, and if you did say that, then it gives Christianity more credibility or somehow. Well, you could only do that if you knew that they weren't true, yeah, I think that's a. What would the argument be? Would the argument be, I know it's not true because those things don't happen? And if you're going to say that, then you've got to have another argument for why they definitely don't happen. And yeah, I don't think it's simple.
Do you know anything specific about the impact of belief in jinns on the progress of science? I don't think there is much, if at all. Islam helps science, but it also hindered it in a lot of ways. And like Edward Grant and Toby Huff talk about this in their books. So, this is why modern science came out of the Christian West and not Islam. So I don't know anything specifically about the belief in jinns, though. I don't think that's related at all. It's not anything I've come across.
No, I've not come across anything either. There was a period of history where a lot of the conditions that I talked about earlier that were present in Christianity that benefited science, a lot of those were also present in Islam, in early Islam. A rational creator God, an ordered universe, human beings with rationality to understand it. And so there was a period of history where there were significant Islamic contributions to scientific thinking. That kind of began to change post Al-Ghazali, because Al-Ghazali was a little bit uneasy with the idea of cause and effect, in the sense of saying, right, cause and effect is something that happens distinctly of God, right? For example, if you've got a piece of cotton and you hold it over a flame and then the cotton catches fire, what is the cause of the cotton catching fire? Well, what we want to be able to say in order to advance science is to say the cause is the flame, right? The flame, that cotton is flammable. In other words, you want to be able to describe it as like a self-contained cause and effect program. And Al-Ghazali is uneasy with that. He wants to say, no, the cause is Allah directly, right? The cotton catches fire directly. It's the will of Allah. And the problem with that is that if you run with that way of thinking, it makes it harder to predict the outcome of an event, because you say, well, what happens the next time you hold the cotton over the flame? It leaves room for you saying, well, it won't catch fire because it might not be God's will for it to happen that time. And that actually can hold back scientific progress. Whereas if you have a very tightly sealed container that says, my cause and effect happens within here, God has overseen the process, but the flame causes the cotton, that is more conducive to scientific progress.
May I ask both your views on theistic evolution? Would you say it contradicts the Bible? If so, how so? No, I don't think it does. I'm an avid theistic evolutionist. I've promoted it in debates and many videos. So check out my Genesis 1 to 11 series. And I don't even bring up evolution, but I think if you go through that series, you'll see how they are compatible and how they're not conflicting.
I think what I would say is, I referred to my earlier answer. I think we're in the middle of a period of history where we are still working things out. It certainly seems, looking at the science, that something along the lines of evolution has happened, right? Like, there's very powerful scientific evidence for that. I do think that does lead to some problems with trying to take the Bible at face value in certain places. But I'm relaxed about it. We must keep doing good science. We must keep reading our Bibles and doing good theology. It's all going to work itself out at the end and fall into place. I think I would probably lean in the direction of theistic evolution, but I still have some questions. Like, personally, I find the idea of pain, suffering, death, even in nature before the fall, I find that a difficult concept. I know that there are lots of answers that have been put forward already. But I'm just being honest. I do find that hard to stomach. It might still be true, right? But I think I would advise, hold these things loosely. Do not hold them tightly. Hold them loosely. And if you're involved in theology or in biology, keep working on it. But hold them loosely.
If anyone's interested, you can check out my video, The Problem of Suffering, a Christian Response, because we also talk about the problem of animals suffering in that video as well. And Justin Mooney helped me with that. So he's a great philosopher. How do you interpret Luke 22:44? This is the verse about sweating drops with blood. I don't think it was in the originals. I think it's omitted from some of the earliest manuscripts. So it may have been a verse that was actually added in later, and we've been able to track this down through textual criticism. So if it was a medical condition from the stress he was about to endure, but I'm not sure if that was in the original. So that's what I would say on that.
Okay, yeah, that's fine by me.
Any good books, any good beginner books on philosophy you'd recommend? Yeah, for Christians, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. Also, Introducing Philosophy by Solomon, I believe is his last name, is a pretty good book. And the reason why I like that one is because he goes through a lot of the classical philosophers, the ancient philosophers, and he has really helpful commentary. And so it's a good place to start. So I'd start with those two.
Yeah, and I would say if you're prepared to wait for a little while, I'm working on book number 4 now, which is with William Lane Craig. We're working together on a book on philosophy. So I'll be popularizing his work. There'll be a chapter on each of the philosophical arguments for the existence of God. But you will have to wait, I don't know, 18 months, 2 years. Don't want to commit myself too tightly to that, but we're a couple of chapters in.
Nice. That's awesome. Just want to say thank you for the work you put in to share the truth. Bless you. Yeah, I appreciate the very generous super chat. I much appreciated that. IP, what would your advice be for a history major about to start second year at this and the discussion surrounding the negative view of Christianity throughout history, the Dark Ages? Yeah, get the book he's got there. It's linked below in the video description. Read that. That will give you what you need to get through and push back in that class. So I highly recommend you actually, there's even, we have a code down below in the video description. We get a discount. So check that out and you can get that book and I guarantee it will help you in what you need.
And just in case they're worried that it'll be like someone might say, oh, well, that's just a Christian book, they're biased and so on. The publisher is Oxford University Press, and so it's come out of a publisher that is well respected. He's a secular publisher from one of the best universities in the world. So, and it's hardback. It's hardback as well. So, if necessary, you can just,
that'll work.
Yeah.
Did Bart Ehrman change his position on Christology in the Synoptic Gospels? I keep hearing it online, but I haven't heard anything. I heard this as well, but then I see video clips of him saying that no, Jesus, he kind of goes back and forth on it. I think some days he's convinced by it, some days he's not. But regardless of that, there's overwhelming evidence that Jesus did teach that he is God. There's a book coming out by Robert Bowman Jr., Ed Komoszewski on this, which will cover this in far more detail. So that book should be out in December. I'm going to try to get them on my channel as well to talk about it. How do you approach people from the Baha'i faith? Well, I don't know any. I've not really looked much into that. It's a minor sect that came out of Iran, like Shia Islam, that they declared heretical. And so they were heavily persecuted in Iran. They kind of got out and spread more. Actually, the guy that plays Dwight from the American version of The Office is in the Baha'i faith. People don't realize that. But I've just not encountered a lot of it, so I would not be much of the expert on it.
I think what we said earlier, ask questions. Like,
there you go.
Befriend people, love people, treat them in a winsome way that makes them think, hey, there's something different about this person. I want what they've got, and ask them, find out. You could say, well, that's interesting. Tell me more about the Baha'i faith. Listen, learn. Where there are things that you can talk about straight away in response, then do it. But if you don't know what to say about something you said, say, I'd love to talk about this again, and then go away and do a bit of work on it and come back.
I've been trying to put my faith in Christ for a while. I'm a recovering addict for several years and recently graduated from college. To anyone struggling or has someone in their life, that is, don't give up. There is hope. That's really great to hear, Justin. I would also say you can put your faith in Christ. It's not based on your works or your moral performance. You can. Paul says in Romans 10, profess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe that God raised him from the dead and you will be saved. Case closed. So
yeah, it's a decision. It's just a decision. You just say, right, Jesus, I'm putting you in charge now.
Right.
I don't want to be in charge of my life anymore. I want you to be in charge of my life. I am giving it to you. Please help me.
That's all you got to do. You don't have to try to. That just is. It's a very simple change. This isn't like Islam where it's all about works. Ephesians 2. We're not saved by works. That's just something we do to show our gratitude. Why do you think large parts of the church in the 1800s were so happy to jump on the conflict bandwagon? To what extent is the modern church still in the bucket? Well, if you read Ronald Numbers, it wasn't that the case. In fact, a lot of the the churches in the 1800s were getting on the science bandwagon. Even in the very conservative Baptist South in the early 1900s, they were teaching evolution in the universities down there, the Christian universities, mind you. The real conflict started to come about is what David was mentioning earlier about this building up of this teaching from White and Draper's books, but then also this young earth creationist radical revival in the 1960s with John Wickham Jr. and Henry Morris. That's really where you have these two. So you have the historians and the science saying we're in war with religion. Then you have the lay people saying, yes, we are, because we think the Bible teaches that everything was made in 6 days. And that's kind of more about where the origin of it is today. But in the 1800s, the spiritual geologists died out, and most people were believing in an old earth and accepting what the science was showing and going towards evolution. Pushback started in the 1900s, Numbers says, with people starting to tie evolution to eugenics. And Christians were like, we're not having any of that. And that was really started the pushback. That was actually more of the issue at the Scopes trial than anything else.
Yeah, I think the book is called The Creationists. Did you say that?
The Creationists. He also has another book called Darwin Comes to America.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. To what extent is the modern church still in this bucket? I think it can depend on denominations, and it can also depend on whether a church has kind of started taking content from certain places. So if people are taking content from, say, Answers in Genesis, they may well find that they do sign up to conflict a little bit more in that church. So it's where you get your information from. It might be a visit. It could be really as simple as like a visiting speaker. You invite a particular speaker in, they give a particular take on the science religion thing, and then for a generation your whole church has embraced that one idea because you had one visiting speaker. So try and look at stuff in the round as much as possible.
My only holdout on theistic evolution is the Imago Dei. It is very easy to take that humans were created uniquely with the Imago Dei. However, evolution posits that some link between humans and proto-humans gained the Imago Dei. Well, I mean, that's actually what Michael Heiser and J. Richard Middleton actually argue, that the Hebrew of Genesis teaches that the Imago Dei was something granted to humanity. Like, it's not this idea that it's a special creation point. It's like we're being called to be God's representatives on earth. So, I mean, like, a lot of biblical scholars say that's kind of what the Imago Dei is supposed to be. So it's actually very much in line. If you check out, I did a video, what does it mean to be the image of God? I also did part of my Genesis 1 to 11 series. Genesis 1b talks about it. So the video is just called Genesis 1b. And it just goes through and shows that a lot of this is very much in line already. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, but check out those videos for more.
Dennis Alexander of Cambridge University, he has suggested a model in which there's an evolutionary process, and then there's one male and one female, and God effectively selects them and says, right, okay, you are now going to be my representatives amongst in this world. And the strength of, I mean, I'm not saying that I'm persuaded by that, but one strength is that God does seem to have done other things like that, where he goes to Noah and he gives a message, right? He goes to Abraham and calls him. There are these other scriptural examples where God seems to pick somebody and say, I'm now going to do something special with you. Yeah, but you may not be persuaded by that. I'm not entirely sure I am, but there are models out there that do posit what you're saying, that God did select a man and a woman and say, right, I'm giving you my image, and you're going to be different.
David, where did your bookshelf go?
Well, I am actually inside a wardrobe, inside a walk-in wardrobe, and I'm not going to show you the rest of it, but yeah, it did cross my mind that I should see. My bookshelf is in the spare room where my dad is sleeping. He's living with us for a little while. I might have gone in there, and then I would have looked really clever. I promise that I have read books.
He assures you he has read some books.
Yeah.
Don't you worry, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. No. All right, so I think we've got through them all. Let me put this back up here. Again, the book is linked below. Anything else you want to say about the book, about anything about this topic in general before we close this out? We've been going for about 2 hours, and it's got to be like 11 o'clock over there. So I want to get you to sleep.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, well, I'm quite happy in the wardrobe because I've got a 10-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old daughter, and they've both got sleepovers here tonight. So actually, I'm basically hiding. We can go and go. What would I say about the book? I would say it's designed to be a really easy read. Like, pick up almost like a fiction book. Pick it up and read it for fun. But I was working with James Ungrianu, and he is the world expert on Draper and White. There is nobody who knows more about Draper and White than James Ungrianu. He is an extraordinary scholar. He has read pretty much everything that Draper and White ever wrote. He knows things about Draper and White that nobody else does. And so being able to work with him on this project was like a game changer. So although it's very easy to read, it is by far the most accurate and up-to-date scholarly description of Draper and White and what happened. So I wouldn't want you to think, oh, okay, it's a popularization, but if I want the real meat, I need to go and find something else. It is absolutely bang up to date with the and it's very, very thorough as well.
Final super chat. God exists in all time. After the fall, he could have slightly altered creation from a point in the distant past, long before Adam and Eve. I guess so. I mean, that's a possibility. Do you modern churches failed Christians because of the 20th fundamentalist approach by church? And even in current times, they don't focus on intellectualism and even asking questions. See, as you don't have enough faith, and we are seeing rise of nuns now. Yeah, I would, from what I can gather from that, I think you're right that is contributing to it, but it'll run its course. And we see these type of cycles happen all the time. We go through, the church has gone through these ups and downs. It corrects itself. I heard a quote recently that if it was always day, we would never see the stars. And I think that's a good point to keep in mind, that sometimes we go through these hardships and we get great people that come out of it and they end up changing the world. So just keep your head up, keep focusing on what's right and true, and everything will work out in the end. So I'll keep that in mind.
Yeah, I agree. It's about those Jesus flags. When you're going to plant a flag, you plant it on a tenet of the faith, right? You don't want to be a fundamentalist on things that aren't fundamental.
Right. And I think that's a great way to put that. So, all right, with that, again, the book is linked below. I highly recommend you guys go get it. I really enjoyed it, and it's a very easy read with a lot of really good scholarship. Dave is working on some other books. They're all, I've got your website down there, so hopefully we'll have you on again at some point. And let me know when your other book with William Lane Craig comes out, and we can talk about that as well. That sounds interesting. So appreciate you coming on. Any final words, final thoughts?
Yeah, keep your eyes on Jesus. And if you haven't got your eyes on Jesus yet, start looking in that direction.
Well said. All right. We'll see you next time. I should be back on my channel next Thursday for a really fun and stupid stream at the same time. We'll see. I'll talk to you guys next time.